My name is Sister Elizabeth, and I'm about to share something that will shake the foundation of everything you thought you knew about the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I have dedicated my life to prayer and contemplation as a Carmelite nun for over 45 years. But on September 23rd, 2023, something happened that changed everything. I died. It wasn't just a moment of sleep or a fleeting blackout. It was 23 minutes and 17 seconds in which I was completely gone from this world. I remember it like it was yesterday. 1 minute, I was pruning roses in the garden, my mind lost in the peaceful rhythm of the task. The next, an excruciating pain gripped my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before, deep, agonizing, as if my very soul was being squeezed from my body. I tried to scream for help, to call out to Sister Agnes, who was working nearby. But no sound escaped my lips. The world around me spun out of control, and with each passing second, the pain grew unbearable. I fell to my knees, my vision going black. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sweet, familiar scent of the roses I had been tending to. And then nothing. But when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the garden. I wasn't even on Earth anymore. At first, I thought I was dreaming, or perhaps trapped in some strange illusion. But it quickly became clear this was no dream. The world around me was bright. So bright it was almost unbearable. But it wasn't like any light I had ever seen before. It was a light that seemed to come from everywhere, from every direction, wrapping itself around me in a way that was almost alive. Colors I had never imagined swirled around me. Sounds filled the air like music, something beyond what human ears can comprehend. And then I saw him, Jesus, standing before me in a brilliance so radiant it should have blinded me. But instead, it filled me with a peace I had never known. His eyes, oh, his eyes, held the weight of eternity. I felt as though he was looking right through me, into the deepest parts of my soul. His presence was not just physical, it was something beyond the boundaries of this world, beyond anything my mind could grasp. "Rise, Elizabeth," he said, his voice a gentle command, one that echoed in the deepest corners of my being. "I have brought you here for a purpose. Today, I will reveal to you truths about the Garden of Eden that have been hidden for millennia." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. How could I, a mere servant, be worthy of such a revelation? What was so important that he would choose me to witness it? Before I could speak, the space around us began to shift. The light, the colors, the sounds, they all faded as the environment transformed. I found myself standing in what I knew, without a doubt, was the Garden of Eden. But this wasn't the Eden I had read about in books. No, this place was more real, more alive, than anything I had ever imagined. The colors were more vivid, the air filled with a sweetness that could only be described as divine. I stood there in awe. The very ground beneath me seemed to hum with life, as if every blade of grass, every tree, every leaf was bursting with the presence of God. But then, Jesus turned to me. "Watch closely," he said, gesturing to a figure in the distance. "This is who your scriptures call the serpent, but what you are about to witness will change everything you think you know." My heart stopped. The figure that approached us was nothing like the serpent I had imagined. It wasn't a snake slithering through the grass. No. It was a being of pure light, adorned in what seemed to be precious stones, stones that captured and reflected the very glory of God. This was no ordinary creature. This was something magnificent, something beyond the realm of human comprehension. A being of such beauty and radiance that it took my breath away. "This is who the Hebrew scriptures call the Nachash," Jesus explained, his voice calm, yet filled with authority. In your English translations, it is rendered as serpent, but the truth is far more profound. Few have ever been granted this vision, Elizabeth. Few have seen the true nature of this being. I was speechless. I couldn't take my eyes off the being before us, who radiated such wisdom, such light. This wasn't a sneaky, evil creature I had imagined from countless sermons and lessons. This was a being of power, a creature who had once stood in the very presence of God. "Look closely," Jesus urged. "This is Lucifer, the morning star, the anointed cherub who once covered my Father's throne." I couldn't believe it. The serpent, the tempter, the deceiver, was not just a lowly creature. He was a being of the highest order, one who had once been in the presence of God, leading the worship of heaven. The weight of this truth hit me like a ton of bricks. This was not just the story of a fall from grace. This was a story of cosmic proportions. The enemy we face is not just a fallen angel, but a being who once held unimaginable power. And the implications of this truth, they were more staggering than I could have ever imagined. As I stood there, awestruck by the revelation of the serpent's true nature, I felt a strange sensation overcome me, almost as if I were being drawn into something, pulled by an invisible force. I wasn't just standing in the Garden of Eden anymore. The air around me began to shift, and before I could comprehend what was happening, the very fabric of reality seemed to bend. I felt weightless, like I was no longer bound to the earth. In an instant, I was moving through something indescribable, a dimension of pure light, a realm so beyond earthly understanding that it made the Garden of Eden pale in comparison. I couldn't see where the light ended because it seemed to surround me from every direction. It wasn't just the brightness of light, but a deep, profound presence that seemed to penetrate every part of me. There were no shadows here, no darkness, only pure illumination. The colors around me were unlike anything I had ever seen in my life. They weren't just variations of red or blue, green or yellow. They were hues that defied description, shimmering and pulsing, as if alive. It was as though the very light itself was communicating, each wave of color carrying a message too deep to comprehend, yet too beautiful to ignore. And then I heard it, the music. It wasn't a melody played by instruments. No, it was the music of the spheres, a celestial harmony that filled every corner of this place. The sounds were not merely heard by the ears. They were felt deep within, vibrating through my very being, filling me with an overwhelming sense of love and peace. It was as if the music was a reflection of the very nature of God, a divine orchestra composed of creation itself. I had never heard anything so pure, so perfect, in all my years of devotion. And yet, even in the midst of this indescribable beauty, I could feel a presence. It was a presence of such magnitude that I knew, even before I saw him, that it was Jesus. There was no mistaking it. I felt my knees buckle beneath me, as if the weight of his holiness was too much for me to bear. And then, there he was, standing before me, in all his glory. His appearance was beyond anything my earthly mind could comprehend. The radiance that emanated from him was not just light. It was power, it was grace, it was a love that could not be measured by human standards. His eyes, they held the depth of eternity, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was the creator of all things. Every moment of my life, every prayer, every act of devotion suddenly felt so insignificant in the presence of his infinite holiness. "Rise, Elizabeth," he spoke, his voice carrying not just through my ears, but through my very soul. "You are here for a reason. I will show you truths that will change the way you see all things. But first, you must understand the magnitude of what you are about to witness." I could barely find the strength to stand, but somehow I managed. He reached out his hand to me, and when I touched it, I felt the world around me shift again. Before me appeared a scene, an image that left me breathless. It wasn't the Garden of Eden anymore. No. This was something deeper, something that transcended time and space. We stood in the very heart of creation. I could see the threads of the universe, woven together in a tapestry so intricate that my mind struggled to grasp its complexity. Every star, every planet, every living creature was part of this grand design, this divine orchestration. It was as if I could see the heartbeat of God in everything that existed. "This is the origin of all things, Elizabeth," Jesus said, his voice soft but filled with power. "This is where the Garden of Eden began, where the rebellion began. This is where the first seed of doubt was planted. Watch carefully. And so I did. The scene before me changed once again, and I found myself looking at a figure that I had once thought was nothing more than a story, a symbol of evil. But what I saw in front of me was not a symbol. It was real. It was beautiful. This being, the one I had been taught to fear, was not what I had imagined. He wasn't a lowly snake, a crawling creature of deception. No, this was a magnificent being, a being of light and wisdom, adorned in glory. He was not just an angel, he was one of the highest, a cherub, a guardian of the very throne of God. His beauty and radiance were overwhelming. This, Jesus said, is Lucifer. He was once the most exalted of all the heavenly beings, the morning star. But look closely, Elizabeth. You will see how pride began to take root in his heart. I watched as the figure, once glorious, began to shift. It wasn't a sudden change. It was gradual. At first, I could see no difference, but then it became clear. His beauty, his light, his wisdom, all of it began to fade, to warp, to twist. It was as though a shadow slowly crept over him, consuming him from the inside out. And with it, I saw something else begin to grow: pride. Pride is an insidious thing. It starts small, but it grows, it takes over. And with it, rebellion. I watched, stunned, as Lucifer, once the morning star, began to turn his back on the very God who had created him. He began to desire something more, something that he could never have. He wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to take the throne of God for himself. It was at that moment that I understood the depth of the rebellion that had taken place. This wasn't just about a disobedient creature. This was about a being who had once stood in the very presence of God, who had known the fullness of divine glory, and yet chose to turn away, to cast it all aside for the sake of pride. This, Jesus said softly, this is the origin of evil. This is where it all began. And it is this being, Lucifer, who would later deceive humanity, drawing them into the same pride, the same rebellion. And at that moment, I realized this wasn't just a story. This wasn't just something to be learned in Sunday school. This was the story of the universe. The fall of Lucifer was the fall of all creation. And the impact of that fall was far greater than I had ever imagined. I stood there, feeling as if the weight of all creation was upon my shoulders. The light, the music, the beauty of the vision, none of it could compare to the gravity of what I was witnessing. Lucifer, the morning star, had fallen. And as Jesus stood beside me, his presence a steady anchor in the whirlwind of my thoughts, I realized something that took my breath away. This was not just the story of an angel's fall. It was the story of the fall of all creation. Every star, every planet, every living thing was affected by this cosmic rebellion. The very fabric of the universe had been torn asunder. And humanity, our fall, was the result of this profound shift in the spiritual realm. But as I stood in that celestial place, I began to see things in a way that I had never imagined before. I had always known about the serpent in the Garden of Eden, of course. I had heard the stories, read the scriptures, attended countless sermons. But what I had been taught, what I had understood, was only a shadow of the truth. Jesus had brought me here for a reason. He was showing me not just the serpent of Genesis, but the true nature of the being who had first brought sin into the world. "Watch carefully, Elizabeth," he said, his voice steady and full of authority. "What you are about to see will change everything." And then the scene shifted. We were no longer standing in the celestial realm, but instead, we were in the Garden of Eden once again. This time, though, it was different. The air was thick with the presence of God, and I could feel the life in the ground beneath my feet. Every tree, every leaf, every flower seemed to hum with divine energy. This was the Eden before the fall, the paradise where everything was good. But there, in the distance, I saw him, the being that I had once known as the serpent. But this time, he was not the grotesque, monstrous creature I had been taught to fear.
No.
This being, this serpent, was magnificent. His body was radiant, glowing with a light that rivaled the very sun. He was adorned with precious stones that shimmered like stars in the night sky. His beauty was beyond words, beyond comprehension. "Look closely," Jesus whispered. "This is who your scriptures call the serpent, but what you see before you is not the creature you have imagined. This is a being of great power, a being of light and wisdom, who once stood in my presence." I felt my heart race as the truth began to settle in. The serpent wasn't just a simple animal, a creature of deception. No. The serpent was a cherub, a guardian of heaven, an exalted being who had once been a part of the divine court. The scriptures spoke of him as the Nachash, but even that word didn't do justice to the reality of the being before me. The word serpent had become a symbol of temptation, of evil, but the truth was far deeper, far more terrifying. This being, Jesus continued, his voice both gentle and sorrowful, was once one of the highest of heaven's beings. He was a guardian of my Father's throne, but it was pride that led to his fall. Pride and the desire to be worshipped, to be like God. I watched in stunned silence as the serpent, Lucifer, moved through the garden, his movements graceful, almost ethereal. There was nothing about him that seemed evil. On the contrary, he appeared wise, noble, full of grace. His every step radiated divine knowledge, and as I watched, I understood something. This was why Eve had not been afraid of him. She had not seen him as a threat, as an adversary. She had seen him as a being of light, of wisdom, of authority, someone who seemed to belong in the Garden of Eden, a creature who seemed to possess knowledge that rivaled even God's. "That is the deception," Jesus explained. He did not come to Eve as an enemy, but as a being of light, as one who possessed wisdom and knowledge. He did not appear as a threat, but as a teacher, as a guide. And through that deception, he was able to lead her astray. I felt my stomach tighten as the full weight of this truth began to sink in. The serpent in Eden was not a lowly, scheming snake. He was a celestial being, a cherub, once glorious, who had fallen from grace and become something else entirely. The temptation in Eden wasn't just a simple seduction. It was the first act of spiritual warfare, the first battle between light and darkness. As Jesus continued to speak, I could feel my understanding expanding. The more I saw, the more I realized how much we, as humans, had misunderstood. The serpent wasn't just a creature of evil. He was a being of immense power, someone who had once stood in the very presence of God, who had once been a part of the divine glory. And yet, in his heart, pride had begun to rise. The serpent's deception, Jesus continued, was not just about a piece of fruit. It was about questioning the goodness of God. It was about planting doubt in the hearts of my creation. Did God really say? The seed of doubt, the first heresy, was planted in that moment. And from that moment on, everything changed. I stood there, in the midst of this revelation, overwhelmed by the depth of it all. How could something so beautiful, so powerful, fall so far? How could the serpent, the very being who had once stood in the presence of God, become the source of all the pain and suffering that followed? And yet, as I stood there, with Jesus beside me, I began to understand. The serpent's deception was the beginning of humanity's fall, but it was also the beginning of the redemption story. The story of salvation wasn't just about human sin. It was about the battle between light and darkness, between good and evil. And in this battle, the victory would not be won through human strength, but through the sacrifice of God himself. As I stood in the Garden of Eden, the weight of the truth I had just learned about the serpent, the angelic being Lucifer, hung over me like a heavy cloud. I was shaken, unable to fully comprehend what I had just witnessed. The beauty of the garden around me, the life in the air, the very presence of God, it all seemed to amplify the gravity of the moment. And yet, despite the sheer brilliance of creation, I knew something was about to change. The peace that had once reigned here was about to be shattered forever. Jesus turned to me, his eyes full of compassion and understanding. He didn't have to say anything. His mere presence was enough to calm the storm inside me. But still, the weight of the revelation about Lucifer, the deceiver, pressed on my heart. "Come, Elizabeth," Jesus said, motioning toward the center of the garden. "There is more you must see." With each step we took, the air grew thicker, the light dimmer. I could sense that something was coming, something that would change everything. My pulse quickened as we approached the place where Adam and Eve had once stood in perfect harmony with God. And then, there he was, the serpent. But this time, he wasn't in his full glory. No longer radiant and beautiful, he was now standing before Eve, not as a creature of light, but as a being that radiated a strange, dark wisdom. His appearance had subtly changed. His beauty remained, but now it was twisted, darkened, as though the light that once defined him had dimmed. The serpent spoke, and his voice was smooth, almost soothing. There was a quiet authority in his words, a confidence that made everything he said seem true, even when it wasn't. I could see Eve standing there, not with fear, but with curiosity. Her expression wasn't one of dread, but one of intrigue. She wasn't running away. No, she was drawn to him, fascinated by the wisdom he seemed to offer. The serpent didn't immediately lie. No, that would have been too obvious, too easy. Instead, he began with a question. Did God really say, "You shall not eat from any tree in the garden"? He asked, his voice laced with curiosity, but also with a hint of doubt. I watched as Eve's eyes flickered, the seed of doubt taking root in her heart. She hesitated, then answered, "We may eat the fruit of the trees in the garden, but of the tree in the middle of the garden, God has said, 'You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.'" The serpent's response was slow, deliberate, as though he knew exactly how to press the right buttons. "You will not surely die," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." It was at that moment that I understood the true power of the serpent's deception. He didn't come to Eve with an outright lie, but with a twisted half-truth. He didn't simply tell her to defy God. No, he made it seem as though God was withholding something from her. He made her believe that God didn't want her to be like him, to have the wisdom and understanding that he had. And in that moment, Eve, once perfectly content in her communion with God, began to question his goodness. The seed of doubt had been planted, and from that seed grew the desire for more knowledge, more power, more control. As the serpent spoke, I could see her eyes widen, not with fear, but with temptation. The very thought of becoming like God was too much for her to resist. She saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. Jesus said softly beside me, his gaze fixed on Eve. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. And with that I saw it. I saw the moment when everything changed. It wasn't just about a piece of fruit. It wasn't just about a simple act of disobedience. No, this was something far deeper. It was a cosmic rebellion, a choice to trust the serpent's word over God's, a choice to doubt the goodness of God, a choice to believe that something better, something more powerful, was within their grasp. I could see it in their eyes, the moment of their fall. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was gradual, like a slow descent into darkness. And as they ate the fruit, I felt the very ground beneath me tremble, as though creation itself was reacting to this act of defiance. The harmony of the garden, the beauty of creation, the divine presence that had filled the air, all of it seemed to shudder. The perfect communion between God and man had been broken. Sin had entered the world, and with it, death. The consequences of that single act of disobedience would ripple through all of creation. I stood there, watching, as the garden around me seemed to change. The once vibrant colors faded, the air grew thick with sorrow. The harmony that had existed between man and nature, between man and God, was no more. And in its place was shame. I watched as Adam and Eve, now aware of their nakedness, tried to hide themselves from God. Their innocence was gone, replaced by guilt and fear. But what struck me most was the look on their faces. They weren't just afraid of the consequences of their actions. No, they were afraid of God. For the first time, they saw him not as a loving creator, but as a judge. And in that moment, I saw the full weight of the fall. It wasn't just the loss of innocence. It was the loss of trust in the goodness of God, the severing of the relationship between the Creator and His creation. But as the scene unfolded before me, I also saw something else. Something I hadn't expected. Jesus turned to me, His eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. "This," He said, "is why I am here." The fall of humanity, the destruction of this perfect relationship, it was never meant to be the end. This was the beginning of the story of redemption. Through this act, humanity's need for a savior was made clear. And through my sacrifice, that relationship will be restored. And in that moment, I understood. The fall was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far greater, something that would unfold through the centuries. Jesus had come to restore what had been lost, to undo the damage caused by that single act of disobedience in the Garden of Eden. As the vision of the Garden of Eden began to fade, I felt myself being pulled back into the very heart of the story, the cross. My surroundings shifted once again, and this time, I found myself standing at the foot of a hill, watching as the scene unfolded before me in vivid detail. I could hear the crowd shouts, the soldiers' commands, the sound of hammers driving nails into flesh. The air was thick with tension, with sorrow, with the weight of the world pressing down on the moment that had arrived. There He was, Jesus. His body was broken, bruised, and bloodied, hanging on the cross. The very sight of Him, so vulnerable, so human, made my heart ache. I had known about the crucifixion. I had read the scriptures, attended the services, and meditated on His sacrifice countless times. But this was different. This was not a story. This was not just theology. This was real. As I stood there, looking up at Him, I saw something more than the physical pain He was enduring. I saw the cosmic significance of what was happening. The agony He was experiencing wasn't just the result of nails in His hands, or a crown of thorns pressed into His head. It was the weight of all creation that He was carrying, the burden of sin and death that had been brought into the world through the fall of Lucifer, through the deception in Eden. I saw it now. The battle that had begun in the garden was not merely a fight between man and a snake. It was a cosmic war between good and evil, light and darkness, creation and corruption. And the cross was the moment when the victory would finally be claimed. "Elizabeth," Jesus' voice broke through the intensity of the scene, gentle but filled with authority. "Look closely. This moment is more than what you see with your eyes. The victory you witness here is not just for humanity. It is for the entire cosmos." I could feel the depth of His words resonate in the very core of my being. This wasn't just a personal sacrifice. This was a cosmic sacrifice, a victory over the serpent, over Lucifer, over sin, and death itself. As I continued to watch, I saw the spiritual significance of His sacrifice unfold before me. The scene on the cross became not just a physical reality, but a spiritual triumph. Jesus, hanging there in agony, was not just suffering for the sins of humanity. He was defeating the very power that had corrupted the world, the power that had begun with Lucifer's rebellion and the fall of Adam and Eve. When Jesus cried out, "It is finished," it wasn't just a statement of His physical suffering coming to an end.
No.
It was a declaration of victory. The moment when the prophecy in the Garden of Eden, that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, was finally fulfilled. I watched in awe as the spiritual reality of His sacrifice unfolded. The serpent, once so powerful, once so beautiful, was defeated. The deception that had begun in the Garden of Eden, the lie that had been planted in the hearts of Adam and Eve, had finally been exposed for what it was. And in that moment, Jesus' death wasn't just a sacrifice for sin, it was the final defeat of the being who had caused it all. "This is why I had to come, Elizabeth," Jesus said, His voice filled with both sorrow and triumph. The serpent, Lucifer, the deceiver, thought he had won. He thought he had corrupted creation. But in this moment, the victory is mine. The defeat of sin, the defeat of death, the defeat of the serpent himself is final. I could see it now, how His death was not just about the forgiveness of sins, but about the cosmic restoration of all things. The damage that had been done when the serpent deceived Eve, when Adam and Eve fell, was not just repaired. It was defeated utterly and completely by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. As I stood there, gazing at Jesus on the cross, I realized something profound. The cross was not just a historical event. It was the fulfillment of a cosmic plan that had been set in motion long before the creation of the world. The fall in Eden was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a story of redemption, a story that would culminate in Jesus' victory over the very being who had started it all. I looked up at the cross, at the broken body of Jesus, and felt a flood of emotions, sorrow, yes, but also deep gratitude, awe, and hope. Through this moment of suffering, Jesus had won. He had defeated the powers of darkness, the forces of evil, and had restored the relationship between God and humanity that had been lost in Eden. Through this sacrifice, Jesus said, the serpent's power is broken. His reign is over. The deception that began in the Garden of Eden has been undone. And now, the victory is mine. And with those words, I felt a deep peace wash over me. The victory had been claimed. The battle that had raged for so long, from the Garden of Eden to the cross, had finally been won. Jesus had not only saved humanity, he had defeated the serpent, the father of lies, the great deceiver. And in that moment, I understood the true depth of his victory. The cross was not just about forgiveness. It was about restoration, the restoration of all things, the restoration of creation, and the defeat of the very being who had corrupted it all. The victory of the cross was not just a spiritual victory for humanity. It was a cosmic victory for the entire universe. As I stood there, looking at the cross, I realized the magnitude of the message that Jesus had entrusted to me. This story, this cosmic battle, was not just for me to witness, it was for me to share. The victory on the cross was not just about the past. It was about the present and the future. It was about the ongoing battle against the serpent, the ongoing work of redemption and restoration. And in that moment, I knew that I had been given a mission to share this truth with the world, to tell others that the battle was already won, that the serpent had been defeated, and that through Christ, we have been given the victory.